Saint Therese of the Child Jesus and the Holy Face was her title in religion. She's known affectionately as the Little Flower. She died when she was just 24 years old. She'd lived as a cloistered Carmelite nun for less than 10 years. She didn't have an apostolate to the poorest of the poor like Mother Teresa of Calcutta. She was not a great reformer of religious life like St. Teresa of Avila. She never went to preach the gospel to the four corners of the world like St. Francis Xavier. She never performed great works. She was not really well known beyond her own small circle in Normandy, France. And yet today she's probably one of the best known and most beloved saints in the entire church. Public sentiment after her death was so great that within 28 years of her passing she was canonized, which is pretty fast. Not only that, but in 1997, John Paul II made her the 33rd Doctor of the Church, which is a very small and distinct group. She's the youngest saint to be so honored, and she's only the third woman. She stands with giants of the faith like Saints Augustine, Thomas Aquinas, Bernard of Clairvaux, John of the Cross, and others as one of the foremost teachers of the faith in the history of Christendom. And yet the only record that we have of her life and her spiritual doctrine are found in her many letters that she wrote, and also her autobiography called Story of a Soul, which was written under obedience while she was a nun in the Carmel of Lisieux. It was published after her death. And yet this is the saint that Pope Pius X declared the greatest saint of modern times. The greatest saint of modern times. That's a pretty lofty title. He said also that she rediscovered the gospel, the very heart of the gospel. So this morning we're going to take a look at this remarkable woman and see how we can benefit from her life and her example and what's come to be known as her little way. Therese was born in France in 1873, the pampered daughter of a mother who had wanted to be a saint and a father who wanted to be a monk. The two had gotten married, but in their early years of their marriage, they determined to live a celibate life until a priest and friend of theirs said, "This is not the way that God intended marriage to work." And they evidently took his advice seriously because they had 9 children, 5 of whom had lived. The 5 children who did live were all girls. When Therese, who was the second youngest child, was not yet 5, her mother died of cancer. Her 16-year-old sister Pauline became like a second mother to her. But Pauline entered a Carmelite convent 5 years later. A few months after Pauline's entrance into Carmel, Therese became so ill with a fever that it appeared she might be dying. But when St. Therese and her sisters and her father prayed before a statue of Our Lady actually appeared to her and smiled, and she was instantly cured. When her older sisters Marie and Leonie also left to join religious orders, Therese was left alone with her last sister Celine and her father. But since her bout with this fever, Therese had become extremely sensitive. Every time she imagined someone was criticizing her or didn't appreciate her, she burst into tears. And then she would cry because she'd cried. Some of you who have daughters for children probably can appreciate some of that. But all this changed on Christmas Eve in 1886. She was 14. She and her sister and her father had hurried home from midnight mass. And at that time in France, the custom was for the children to leave their shoes by the fireside, and the parents would fill them with gifts. Now, by 14, most kids had outgrown this custom, but Therese was her father's little queen, so to speak, and she still expected gifts to be left in her shoes. As she and her sister were entering the house, they overheard their father sigh and say, Thank goodness this is the last year we're going to have to do this sort of thing. Now, Celine obviously knew that Therese had overheard her father and thought that this would occasion an outburst of tears. But surprisingly, the tears never came. Something incredible had happened to her. Later, she would describe this event as a Christmas miracle, when Jesus came into her heart and did for her what she couldn't do for herself. He had made her more sensitive to her father's feelings than her own. In her autobiography, she referred to this episode at Christmas as her conversion. Soon after, Therese resolved to enter Carmel as soon as possible. When the superior of Carmel decided that this was not a good idea to let a 15-year-old child into the monastery, she, at one point, was very shy, but at this point she went with her father to the bishop to kind of appeal to him. When the bishop also refused her, she decided to go a little higher. Her father had planned to take her and her sister Celine on a pilgrimage to many of the shrines of France and also in Italy. The highlight of the trip being an audience with the Pope at the time, Pope Leo XIII. Now the pilgrims, because there were so many of them, had been forbidden to speak to the Holy Father. They didn't want people gumming up the line at the audience. But Therese, when it came her turn to see the Holy Father and receive his blessing, she began to beg him to let her enter into Carmel at an early age. The Holy Father gently blessed her and said, "You will enter if God wills it." But that answer wasn't really good enough for her at the time, and she kept pleading with him. And two of the Vatican guards had to actually carry her off. So she felt like this was a miserable failure. The Holy Father hadn't given in to her request. She was probably very embarrassed. But it's interesting how God works. The Vicar General of her diocese had seen this episode and was impressed by her courage. And through his working, and of course the working of the Holy Spirit, shortly thereafter, she was given permission to enter Carmel at 15 years old. A month after her entrance, her father suffered a series of strokes that left him affected both physically and mentally. This was, of course, a great blow to Therese and her sisters, all of whom would enter the same Carmelite monastery in Lisieux eventually. Her sister Celine would be the last to enter Carmel. She actually stayed behind to care for their ailing father until he died. Now, Therese knew as a Carmelite nun she would never be able to perform great deeds. She said, "Love proves itself by deeds. So how am I to show my love? Great deeds are forbidden me. The only way I can prove my love is by scattering flowers, and these flowers are every little sacrifice, every glance and word, and the doing of the least actions for love." This is the heart of what has come to be known as her little way. She seized every opportunity presented to her to offer a sacrifice, no matter how small. She smiled at the sisters she didn't like. She ate everything that she was given without complaining, which meant that she very often got the worst of the leftovers. One time she was accused of breaking a vase, which she hadn't broken, and instead of arguing, she sank to her knees and asked forgiveness. These little sacrifices cost her more than bigger ones, for they went unnoticed by others. No one told her how wonderful she was for offering these secret humiliations and good deeds. One of her favorite quotes is from St. Alphonsus de Liguori, and it kind of helps to illustrate, I think, the emphasis that she had on love in ordinary, though difficult, situations. St. Alphonsus said, "Charity consists in bearing with those who are unbearable." Charity consists in bearing with those who are unbearable. Through her early years in the convent, Therese continued to worry about how she could achieve holiness. She didn't just want to be good, she wanted to be a saint. She thought there must be a way for people living hidden little lives like hers to be great saints. She said, "I've always wanted to become a saint. Unfortunately, when I have compared myself with the saints, I've found that there is the same difference between the saints and me as between a mountain whose summit is lost in the clouds and a humble grain of sand trodden underfoot by passers-by. Instead of being discouraged, I told myself, God would not make me wish for something impossible. And so in spite of my littleness, I can aim at being a saint. It is impossible for me to grow bigger, so I put up with myself as I am, with all my countless faults. But I will look for some means of going to heaven by a little way, which is very short and very straight, a little way that is quite new." St. Therese likened this new little way to the difference between climbing a long, steep flight of stairs and taking the elevator to the top of a building. She felt that the elevator to the summit of holiness was the arms of Jesus, and the way to climb aboard that elevator is love. In one of the most famous passages from her autobiography, St. Therese described her vocation. I think each of us could and should prayerfully proclaim these words with her. "I understood that the church had a heart, and that this heart was burning with love. I understood that love comprised all vocations, that love was everything, that it embraced all times and places, and a word that it was eternal. Then in the excess of my delirious joy, I cried out, 'O Jesus, my love, my vocation, at last I have found it. My vocation is love.'" Whether priest or religious, brother or sister, married or single man, woman or child, this is the vocation of every Catholic Christian: love. Simple, selfless, self-sacrificing love of God and neighbor, which puts our own will, our own needs and desires after the will of God and the good of our neighbor. Love. Love in imitation of Christ's love for each and every one of us. In 1896, on the morning of Good Friday, Therese began to cough up blood. She would later be diagnosed with tuberculosis. The pain of her illness was so great that she said that if she had not had faith, she would have taken her life without hesitation. Her physical illness was accompanied by an interior journey through spiritual darkness, which lasted until her death. But in spite of it all, Therese maintained her joyful exterior and was silent about the extremity of her suffering, which culminated in her death on September 30th, 1897. Again, she was just 24 years old. She was canonized by Pope Pius XI in 1925, and as I said earlier, she was declared a Doctor of the Church in 1997 by John Paul II. I think the fact that she was declared a Doctor of the Church is significant. As I said before, there are thousands of saints, but there's only 33 Doctors of the Church. The saints are those who excelled in heroic virtue. They are the best of us. The Doctors of the Church are those whom we might refer to as the best of the best. St. Therese has been selected among these very these very distinct great minds and hearts of the Church. Over the course of 2,000 years, again, only 33 Doctors of the Church. There are 3 requirements that have to be fulfilled by a person in order to merit being included among their ranks. First, holiness that is truly outstanding, even among the saints. Second, their depth of doctrinal insight. And finally, an extensive body of writings which express authentic and the life-giving tradition of the Catholic Church. As I said previously, our saint today didn't really study or write extensively other than her letters. She didn't earn an advanced ecclesial degree. She didn't expand upon or clarify deep theological questions or defend the doctrines of the church against the errors of heresy. So what was her area of expertise? In what area did she express this depth of spiritual insight? In what way did her holiness prove itself to be even more outstanding than the holiest of the saints? Love. She excelled to a super-heroic degree in her humble, childlike trust in Almighty God and her love of God and neighbor. And I think it's in this that we learn so much from the life of St. Therese. Her perseverance in prayer, even in dark or dry periods. Her perseverance in trial, in suffering. Her heroic virtue. These are all laudable and worthy of our study and imitation. I would submit to you that it's the love of this saint manifested in the ordinary circumstances of our daily lives. Love offered in imitation of the self-sacrificing love of Jesus Christ on the cross, which merits our greatest attention and imitation. This is a love that's content to be anonymous. Love offered to others, but known only to God. Again, this is the heart of her little way. She explained that the most trivial work, the least action when inspired by love, is often of greater merit than the most outstanding achievement. It's not on their face value that God judges our deeds, even when they bear the stamp of apparent holiness, but solely on the measure of love we put into them. And there is no one who can object that he is incapable of even this much, for such love is within the reach of all men. In his homily at the Mass on Mission Sunday in 1997, when he declared Therese Doctor of the Church, John Paul II emphasized that the little way can indeed be followed by everyone. He said, "The way she took to reach this ideal of life is not that of the great undertakings reserved for the few, but on the contrary, a way within everyone's reach, the little way, a path of trust and total self-abandonment to the Lord's grace. It's not a prosaic, which is to say commonplace or humdrum way, as if it were less demanding. It is, in fact, a demanding reality, as the gospel always is. But it is a way in which one is imbued with a sense of trusting abandonment to divine mercy, which makes even the most rigorous spiritual commitment light." Everything that we do or say is an opportunity, a precious moment available to us to offer to God with love. What we do for work, a conversation with a passerby, what and how we eat, a smile or kind word in the face of an annoyance, in the face of a pain or difficulty, our perseverance in prayer when we're weary or dry or distracted. These are all precious jewels when offered out of love for God. The key, I think, is seeing these difficulties that each of us face every day, not as obstacles to our growth in holiness, but as opportunities for our growth in holiness. They are means God gives us each and every day to grow closer to Him. St. Therese longed to be a missionary, to be an apostle. She even hoped to be a martyr. But she recognized that she, like most of us, would probably never have the opportunity to do such great things for God and neighbor. She recognized that every moment, every simple and seemingly insignificant and ordinary daily circumstance is pregnant with a command from God, with an opportunity to serve God out of love. And this should be our focus. We shouldn't wait for occasions to do great things for God, but we should seize the innumerable opportunities God gives us each and every day to live, like St. Therese, a simple life of heroic virtue, right where He's placed us. I think it's very interesting that St. Therese, with St. Francis Xavier, shares the title Patron of Missionaries. She never left her convent in Lisieux, but she's one of the patrons of missionaries. She's, I think, been given this title because she shared the faith heroically in her own small circle. And she shows all the faithful in every age and every vocation how to do the same with her little way. And I think it's very important for us as we continue our course in apologetics to remember that this is the basis for apologetics, personal holiness. There's no more effective argument for the truth than a holy life. And again, it need not be extraordinary. It need only be well lived out of love for God and neighbor. People will not always listen to reason, but they can't argue with love. When we give witness to our love of God and neighbor by seizing the simple occasions of our daily life as opportunities for love and trust in God, even though we might not ever leave our hometown, we too go out to all the world and share the good news.
So behold the Lamb who was